Hello. I am excited. I mean, you got to know how excited I am to celebrate episode 200 with you in a very special way with a very special guest. Just getting him on the show is an honor and a bit of a technical miracle, given his innumerable accomplishments as an inventor, diplomat, scientist, writer, community organizer, and perhaps the least known of his accomplishments, a world-class marketer. He's a skilled publicist. He practically invented content marketing. He started at least 2 social networks and authored the first best-selling self-help book in America. In fact, he was such a successful marketer of his printing business that he was able to retire comfortably at the age of 42. Now, but on a far grander scale, this is the man who marketed a revolution to a king, without whose efforts we don't get the money, the weapons, the military expertise, the troops, and ultimately the naval support we needed to defeat the British and win our independence. And thanks to my friend at Zoom, I actually have a special installed time travel button, which has allowed me to be thrilled to welcome Dr. Benjamin Franklin to the show. Dr. Franklin, it is such an honor.
Fortunately, I have that same time travel button, and I can come see you, Dr.
It's a treat. I have to ask, how are you feeling? Is your gout giving you any trouble these days?
Well, today is a good day for the gout, yes.
Today is a good day.
Keep my foot propped up here.
Yes. Well, now speaking of health, we're going through a global pandemic right now, and you've been through a couple of these yourself, right?
Oh yes, I lived. Fortunately, my family stayed away from the fever of 1721 in Boston with the smallpox, and that was a nasty one. So yes, I'm not unfamiliar with that sort of thing.
Now, one of the things that I really admire about you is your willingness to learn and change your opinion over time. When you were still in Boston as a kid working for your brother, his newspaper came out against the idea of vaccination, I think against Cotton Mather for smallpox. Today, he would have been called an anti-vaxxer. What happened later in your life to change your opinion on that?
Well, it was not exactly a vaccination. It was more of an inoculation.
Yes, you're right.
It was not easily calibrated or anything like that, and there were some problems with it. But Cotton Mather was a wonderful man. By the way, do you know where he got the idea of the inoculation?
No, I don't.
It was from one of his black slaves from the Caribbean. And yes, they had slaves in Boston at that time. And he had seen that done in the Caribbean and actually told Cotton Mather about it. So that's something a lot of people don't know about. But yes, I suppose I became less skeptical about it. I'm still a little concerned about the fact that, you didn't always know exactly how much of it you were getting and all. But when I lost my 4-year-old son to smallpox, it became very personal for me. Something that's haunted me throughout my life. He had a bit of cold. We were sort of delaying having him inoculated, and he did contract and succumb from smallpox, and it certainly has stayed with me all my life. It's not
I just can't imagine anything worse than losing a child. It's really just and I know what did haunt you. But another thing that's very topical right now is the issue of racism in the United States. And 230 years ago, you were the only founding father arguing against slavery at the Constitutional Convention. And you even wrote a satirical letter to an editor about an Algerian prince who defended white slavery and as a way of calling attention to the issue. Why did you feel the need to take on this cause so late in your life?
And don't forget that I also, even though I had agreed to the 20-year compromise in the Constitution, I did write a letter at the behest of the Philadelphia Quakers. I wrote a letter to the Congress to ask them to take up the issue of slavery. So I kind of broke my my agreement there, but it was a very important thing. Well, first of all, I don't know. A lot of people don't realize it, and I'm another a shame in my life was the fact that there was a time when I did hold people in slavery, and a couple of household slaves, and I'll tell you what changed me. There were many things. First of all, one of my neighbors, Anthony Benezek, who was a Quaker, had a school for young Negro children, as we called them then, and he kept trying to persuade me to come see his school. And I finally did a few times, and I saw, and I wrote that I saw that these young black children were as bright as white children when given the opportunity to be educated, and that certainly began to change me. And over the years, I have tried to sort of formulate what exactly that change was for me and for others. And I honestly believe we were brought up at that time to think of these people as another species almost, not fully human, if you will. I know it's a brutal thing to say, but that's the way it was. And it occurred to me that when you finally realize that someone else is like you, it becomes quite difficult to hold them in bondage. That's the simplest way I can put it.
Yeah, and I think again that was just it's an example of you really coming to grips with something that you learned over your years as and I think your position on Native Americans changed
Yes,
as well, and it's
and Germans competing in the printing business. I tried to open a couple of German language newspapers in the Germantown section of what was a separate town, Philadelphia. And I suppose that colored my thinking a bit. But you know what? But it occurred to me over the years, and that we're meant to grow. We're meant to change, Drew. We're not meant to be, to me, as we were when we came out of the womb. We're meant to soak up what we experience in life and process that.
well, I think it's one of the remarkable aspects of your personal journey is that your dad didn't really you like got 2 years of formal education, and yet you were honored with a doctorate degree from so many places.
Six of them, Drew. Six of them.
Six. Oh yeah, but who's counting? Six.
Here and
Right.
abroad.
And yeah, and so you never stopped educating yourself, which
Oh
is
no, no.
really
Well, education, and I tell this to young people and older people. I speak to a lot of senior groups as well. I say, you don't have to stop learning after 3 o'clock, or start at 8 o'clock or whatever ungodly hour they're sending children to school now. But there is so much to educate us, and one thing I have never ever been able to endure is boredom and inactivity. And so even on my voyages back and forth from Europe, which were 8 trips altogether, 4 round trips, I was always occupied with something, and it's just the way I am, and I think it's the way we're meant to be.
well, I wish more folks shared your curiosity and a lifetime because it certainly keeps life interesting. Now, there's an expression, Dr. Franklin, in modern times called cool cats. And it wasn't used in your lifetime. I know that for a fact. But you would have been one of them. And I use the term today to describe particularly successful marketers. And CATS is an acronym, which stands for courageous, artful, thoughtful, and scientific, all of which apply to you. And I think it would be a great framework for the rest of our conversation and be able to draw the parallel of why you ultimately were so successful as a marketer. But let's start with courage. There are so many moments of courage in your life, whether it was leaving home at 17, heading off to England shortly thereafter, standing silent before a belligerent British Parliament in 1774, not to mention signing the Declaration of Independence. Where did all this courage come from?
Well, I don't know. I guess I've never thought of it as courage, Drew. I just part of it is that other C, curiosity. As far as the leaving home, I think I began to deduce in Boston as a young man that Boston was a pretty tight city, and I didn't see a lot of room for growth there. And I thought it'd be best to go. I stopped in New York, and New York was still pretty small down there at the tip of the island. And so I went on to Philadelphia, and that certainly, I suppose it took courage, or maybe just being without any sort of a clue, if you will. But I did, and as far as those trips back and forth across the ocean, I was duped by a politician to go to England the first time when I was 18. I should have thought that he was a politician when he starts promising me things. Later I learned that when a politician opens his mouth, that's not to even listen. But I knew that the Congress wanted me to go to Paris, for example, and even the colony had sent me to come to London earlier. I knew that their reasoning that they would listen to me because I was probably the only American they'd heard of personally because of my published work in the field of electricity. So I accepted that. I knew that I could probably be more effective. I thought I'd be more effective than I was against the British. But anyway.
Well, let's talk about this. It's so interesting. I love I appreciate your humility. And I would say in 1776, at the end of the year, when you're getting on that ship, you are a wanted man.
Oh, I am. I changed my will. I made a new will. Because I knew that there was a price on my head, and there were privateers and British warships out there in the Atlantic, and I knew the risks that I was taking. But again, I'd had a pretty good life, not realizing then that I had so much yet to do and so much yet to accomplish. I thought, well, goodness, I'm 70 years old. But I've never been able to stop.
Well, it's true. And it's amazing to me. I mean, I think about that moment when you're heading to France.
Yes.
And you're going there basically with your hat in your hand.
I'm trying to sell a rather faulty product here.
Yeah. And what made you think that you had a chance of actually being successful when you get on that ship?
I don't know, hubris, perhaps. I don't know.
Maybe.
No, it's. I just thought, I thought that I could. I knew that France, like most European countries, lacked the wealth of natural resources and such that we had here. I knew there were things here in America they had already lost. I think the other thing might be revenge. I thought, hey, they lost America 20 years before. Maybe we can convince them that, here's a chance to get some of it back and also to get the goods that we had. And, so there were factors that I thought perhaps, that, for lack of a better word, I could sell.
Now, when you're in Paris and what do you think was if we think about this as marketing, what do you think ultimately persuaded the court and the king to actually start to fund the revolution?
Well, I think that their self-interest, and this is what I think politics and marketing and diplomacy and everything else is based upon, is self-interest. Their self-interest again was peaked enough, I think, for them to start giving us some money and some supplies. And when we really came down to getting the support as far as troops, warships, and such, what really fueled that was we actually won some battles over here. General Washington, to his great credit, even though he didn't win a lot of battles early on, and kept an army in the field because he lacked the vanity, I believe, of a lot of the British generals, and he knew when to leave. But I think actually Saratoga, Washington Crossing, these things obviously made a difference. Nobody wants to bet on a horse that keeps losing. And the other hindrance, I think, was the very simple one. I was trying to persuade a king to overthrow another king.
Yeah.
And it might happen to him sometimes. Sometime, could happen, right?
You could say it was self-interest, but ultimately there's a lot of interests here that are complicated. So they send over Adams a couple years later, 1778, I believe.
We were both from New Englanders, both from Boston, had a lot of similarities in that sense, but we looked at the world differently. First of all, John Adams is a man I have deep respect for. We could not have done what we did without his fire, and literally fire. And but we looked at things differently. He came over to Paris very specifically to do the right things. He wanted to dress properly for court, which he did. He spoke French well. He criticized mine. He went to Harvard. I went to the second grade, but I learned what I knew from books, and not very well. But the French people loved me because they thought I was sincere. He dressed for court very properly. When I dressed in my old brown linen suit and frequently wore my fur cap that I had gotten in Quebec on a failed mission to get the Québécois to join our cause. I was, again, I suppose, what would you call it? Spin? I don't know.
Well, I'm gonna move and call that artful, and I'm gonna talk about and I want to set the picture
we
here.
Operated differently, and,
right?
You probably know the story about our when we slept together. We better explain.
Yes. Please explain.
Traveling up to Staten Island, we had to share a room in New Brunswick, New Jersey, in an inn. And it turned out we also had to share a bed, and that wasn't uncommon at the time. I was a great proponent of fresh air, and I wanted the window open. And John was complaining that the window should be. We would catch our death of cold. The irony of it is that I'm ashamed to say that I was the one who caught the cold.
Yes, exactly. So that was his one moment where he may have been right, but
he was right many times, I'm sure. But you know what? I believe sometimes you have to break some rules in order to accomplish what you want to do, and there's a proper way, and then maybe there's an effective way. I don't know.
Kind of a renegade, I think, is the way I would describe that. Breaking some rules. So you show up in court, and you are the first individual who had ever shown up in court who wasn't in court attire. And I want to sort of imagine this is Louis the 16th. This is Versailles.
I'm just a humble printer. Where would I get court attire?
Exactly. Now, I will remind you, you had shown up in court attire when you had visited France much earlier. So, yes, but it's okay. So this is why I want to point out the artfulness of your approach to the court. You presented yourself as sort of a symbol of American wilderness, and you were not threatening.
They thought I was a Quaker, Drew. I was an old Quaker. They thought I was a Quaker.
But if you think about branding and what that is about, if you go into court and you look like everybody else, you're just sort of that. But you walked in and you were completely different. And I want to share the fact that picture, that image of you with the raccoon cat cap.
The fur was Martin, just to be
Martin.
specific. Yes,
Thank you so much for that clarification. It was Martin fur. The Martin fur cap went viral, as they say today. That was photographed on everything. I mean, not photographed. I mean, you were on China. You were on cups.
Oh, yes.
Didn't some women even style their hair, like call it the Franklinian?
People who'd never seen me drew what they thought I'd look like. That's why you see a lot of variation in those images.
People who had never seen you created those images. Well, anyway, you went viral. There was a sort of an artfulness to it.
Viral. Are we back to the smallpox again?
No. I want to sort of emphasize this from a marketing standpoint. You definitely set yourself up, but you also, I will argue, John Adams walks into court and says, well, give me the money, essentially.
It's 10 o'clock in the morning and nobody's there.
Right. Because he was a Puritan. He got up in the morning. He actually lived many of the, early to bed, early to rise things that you had in your almanac.
Pointed that I didn't.
He was. It's like you're not living by your own maxims. Well, anyway, uh, you were quite a fan of the Socratic method, and I think that's so interesting, and in fact informed how you approached it. Were you able to apply that at all when you were arguing before the court?
I think somewhat. You know, I mean, it would propose certain scenarios, if you will, and what if this, and what if there's this and there's that. And by the way, it's in thinking about this over the years, I decided that I was greatly influenced more than I knew by the Quakers in Philadelphia, not only to change my views on slavery and such, but Quakers have a system that they've always had from the 17th century called queries, and it's very similar to that. I was never a Quaker, but I was a member. I was most closely aligned with the Quaker Party in the state assembly when I was elected there, and I would hear that sort of just what it was sort of instinctual for a Quaker to sort of raise an argument that way, rather than disputation, which they would abhor. But so I think I was again influenced by many things around me, and I think that's important.
Yeah, well, you were not stuck in a position, and that enabled you to sort of listen. Now, one of the things
I wasn't always that way. You'll see in my autobiography that I decided as a young man, and I was disabused of disputation by some older, wiser mentors, and I really figured out, fortunately, fairly early on, that it doesn't matter whether you're right or wrong as far as your argument's concerned. Sometimes you have to go about things a different way.
Interesting. That's the artfulness in you, and that is. And I want to point out one other aspect that I've always admired in your approach to communication in writing. And for example, you're famous for writing satires and your wit that showed up in Poor Richard's Almanac. Why do you think sort of these artful approaches are so effective, and they were so effective in your lifetime, and are still effective?
Well, I read everything as a child, and one of the people I read was Jonathan Swift. He was a great late 17th century, early 18th century satirist, and I saw how people responded to that. Sort of sometimes you get the point when it comes at you from sort of an oblique angle, sometimes more than you'll get it. When it comes at you straight, sometimes you'll just resist it, and even if you're in power. But I honestly think that when you see people are laughing at how you are depicted, perhaps you start to think perhaps there's something there. I used a lot of different names for those things.
You did. I could have started the show introducing you as Silence Dogood, but not too many of the audience would have actually known who that was. But I am reminded of a couple of things in the 17 when you were in your second trip to England, and you're arguing with the British about one suggestion that they still were doing was wanting to send all their criminals to the U.S. and and you suggested sending the rattlesnakes of America to over there. That didn't go over well, though, did it?
No, it didn't.
No, sometimes. And then I think another idea. There was another satire. Was it the King of Prussia who was going to, there was some story about the King of Prussia that you used. And at some point they were outraged. Oh, that the King of Prussia was going to lay claim to England as right. So you use that approach quite regularly.
Well, yes. I mean, just because you can do it, that doesn't mean someone else can't do the same thing to you, and otherwise, if I had just said that's a ridiculous idea or you can't do it, they would have probably just said, well, yes, actually we can. But sometimes you have to go around the back.
Yes, sometimes you have to be artful with using humor to sort of show the silliness of a situation. And I mentioned you started a couple of social networks at the very beginning of the show. One was the Junto, and the other the American Philosophers Society. Let's talk about the Junto.
All right.
This wasn't like posting on Facebook. I mean, this was members of the Junto had to do a lot of things.
Well,
I
yes,
mean,
they were very selective. You know, it's perhaps they thought that there were 12 of us at the beginning. It's sort of like there was sort of an apostolic requirement there. I don't know, but the yes, we wanted. I mean, I think the overriding purpose of that group was simply we were young men of limited education, limited means at that time. We came to a city. We came to a city as young people. When I arrived here in 1723, this city was 40 years old, unlike Boston, for example. And the bigger problem was that our founder, William Penn, laid out wonderful plans for the city, but spent fewer than 4 years altogether in this country due to being a terrible businessman, being out of favor with the new regime, all sorts of things, being in debtor's prison. But anyway, we had to invent a city. We had no institutions. So we wanted families, we wanted businesses here, we wanted a city that worked. And so I think we found that, and we were not wealthy enough to have membership in a private club or anything like that, or even in the assembly at that point. So we thought we need to sort of start from the ground up, and the best way to do it is to, again, use that Socratic method at times and other things to raise questions. How do we do this? So we needed people. We were very careful to sort of engage people who were really in that mindset, I think.
and so one of the questions that that came up in every Junto meeting was, has anyone new arrived of note, of merit, that we could help in some way? And I thought, what a thoughtful thing is it. It wasn't just the 12 of you, but it was,
No,
how do
we
we,
insular, no.
and that's so interesting. And you must have brought a lot of young men through, what a helping hand that must have been to
We
those
also
folks.
spun off, if you will, the group and into smaller groups, which we did also with the fire company, by the way. So it's we encourage people to sort of branch out and start other similar groups.
Now, I want to talk about a little bit about your leadership style in this thoughtfulness section, because one of the challenges, I think, early on when you started thinking of all the things that could be done in Philadelphia, you sort of you ran against some people who sort of said, "Oh, that Franklin, he just wants all the credit." And so,
Right.
how did you manage to sort of step back in,
No,
because
I didn't even have all these ideas, Drew. I mean, if people say, "Oh, you started this, you started that, you started this," and they weren't even all my ideas. But I seem to be the person that people decided to come to because they thought I could figure out a way to get it done. I think that's, again, curiosity, creativity. You mentioned the Philosophical Society, and just to clarify that for people, it's not about people sitting around talking about Plato and Aristotle. It's what you would call science, we call natural philosophy. And so the American Philosophical Society, we based it on the Royal Society in London. My friend John Bartram, who was a Philadelphia naturalist, the most prominent one in America, in fact, Linnaeus himself said that Bartram may have been one of the most prominent naturalists in the world. Another self-taught farmer from the edge of Philadelphia. But he talked to me about it because he knew that I would have more contacts. I would have perhaps come up with a way of making it happen. And we began to identify people who should be involved in it, from all sorts of walks of scientific pursuits, even including things like botany and agriculture and all sorts of things. People of merit, who can make we needed to create an intellectual community in this country, which we did not have.
Well, it's interesting because in the ensuing 250 years since you founded that, science has is come under challenge in our modern era in a way that it hasn't in a long time, and folks are suddenly not wanting to believe in science. So you certainly did.
Like,
In
truth gets in the way of what people want sometimes.
Funny how that is, huh? Yeah, wow. You also started a library, or again, you helped make a library happen.
We
You
ran out
helped
of
make.
books to read. That's the simple thing about that.
There it is. You had
My
a book
friends
club.
and I, who would buy all the books we could afford and share the books, and we finally decided that in the long range, their thought, I'm sure, was that this new what group of colonies at that time needed, Philadelphia specifically needed a library, but we needed a library. And fortunately, I had the good fortune to engage as a young man with a mentor named James Logan, who was one of the wealthiest men in America. He had the largest personal library in America. He taught me many things. He changed my philosophical point of view and various things. He was a brilliant man, but we went to him and said, what do we need to do to start this library? He gave us some books, but he also told us which books to order from London, all this sort of thing. It wasn't yet a free library. We needed to, it was a subscription library with a very modest subscription. But, and I read later an account of a European who visited and said that the Library Company of Philadelphia has made the farmers and tradesmen as educated as the nobility in Europe, which we were quite pleased with.
There you go. And ultimately, you ended up, I know, a visitor late in life. I think you had, what, 4,000 books in your own personal library,
I
which
had
was.
to build another wing on my house when I was over 80 in order to house, have a floor for my library and another floor for my musical instruments and all this sort of thing. So yes, I had a lot of books. You might say it was, I don't know, it was sort of an avenue to the information. It was where you had to get the information.
And so it just occurred to me, and I was thinking about you and your library, and I'm imagining young Noah Webster visiting you and suggesting, and the two of you sort of thinking about redoing the English alphabet. I think there was a positive, you know, part of the talk about your philosophy about why you wanted to change the spelling and why you felt this could sort of, if you will, democratize the
Well,
language.
people spell things the way they wanted to anyway. If you look at the writings from that time, people were using it, and it made sense to me to just sort of I thought perhaps it would allow more people to be educated at least to some level, and if it sounds like, if this is what it sounds like, let's sort of spell it that way. And why should we just have more things to memorize? We've got other things to do.
There you go. Well, and of course, Webster really did play ultimately a big contribution in sort of defining what the language was. You can't have a conversation with Dr. Franklin without talking about science and scientific. And I'm going to give you some context. What's interesting in modern day marketers, they can be courageous, come up with just a brilliant strategy. They can be artful in how they communicate to their customers and prospects. They can be thoughtful in that they do things for their employees and their customers to keep them happy and loyal. But if they don't have a little science, and that in this case it's sort of test and learn and measurement, you had no formal training as a scientist. And when you retired at the ripe old age of 42, you started this sort of almost, the pursuit of electricity initially was really just kind of like a hobby thing. But
it was a parlor game for people, make someone's hair stand on end, make somebody jump. It's sort of, and there were a few serious people who were, I thought, going about it the wrong way, and many of them didn't tell about their experiments. I always thought if you're going to conduct an experiment, it's a good thing to be alive to talk about the results.
Well, speaking of that, you almost killed yourself at one point.
Yes,
with a
that wasn't even an experiment. That was trying to kill a turkey before Christmas.
yeah, I want to know who the turkey was in that experiment.
Well, I
Uh,
said, my young friend Philip Singh and I thought, well, we could kill this turkey with electricity. We might even be able to cook it somehow with electricity. And as careful as I was with that whole kite experiment, and I was extremely careful with that, but I got a little careless, I suppose, and got a hold of a wire that I shouldn't have. And um, my friends say that there was a loud crack and a flash of light, none of which I remember, and that I sort of ended up across the room and was out for a couple of minutes. And I like to say I tried to kill a turkey and almost cooked my goose.
there you go. Amazing. But ultimately, you help define, and I think a lot of people, everybody knows the kite thing, but I don't think they're always well aware that the terms positive and negative were things that you coined and recognized that you, even the notion of a battery. I mean, you had these Leyden jars, but you were sort of the one, I think, who
Right.
came up with the notion of
Right.
that.
I also coined, as far as I know, the term current for the flow of electricity because I, someone told me that I created or at least proved that concept of electricity flowing rather than just sort of hopping from point to point.
And one of the things, so you figure out this notion of a lightning rod. And when I read a lot about this particular, in fact, there's a whole book that just talks about this area of the science of your discoveries. And what it shocked me or surprised me was how resistant a large group, particularly the churches, because you were messing with God's will.
I
Talk about
suppose
that.
that's a lot of people looked at it.
It was really, and to me, I looked at it and said, never underestimate group stupidity because they could have protected their churches, and a lot of churches burned down as a result of that. And it
I
took a,
thought, perhaps I thought that if God was going to kill somebody, there were many other ways and many other agents to accomplish that
oh,
without
I
lightning.
know. Here's the one that I read. Prior to putting lightning rods, what they used to do was send gentlemen up to the very top of the steeple, and they would ring the bell. And of course, lots of those people got electrocuted.
But yes, yes.
Not a good idea.
No,
Anyway,
no, I
so,
did think of the idea of putting bells, attaching bells to the lightning rods to sort of alert me to that activity in the air. In fact, my wife hated that. She hated those bells going off.
what's funny that I think the lightning rod was sort of a lightning rod issue at the time.
I
That's
suppose
a that's a little
I had a few of
multi-generational
them.
humor. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So behind all of your science was a relentless curiosity, no doubt about that. And obviously, the whole scientific part for me, when I talk about that in the context of marketing, it's not just that you want to measure what you're doing; it's that you're constantly experimenting and learning. And I think your whole life was a constant experiment, and you participated in so many experiments, whether it was bringing Philadelphia to really become a thriving city, to your scientific endeavors, to Declaration of Independence and a Constitution. Uh,
Well, I think helping to create, pardon me, the first meaningful republic, probably since the Roman Republic, and sort of creating even though we based it in some ways on the British system, really creating a government unlike anything else that existed. That certainly is an experiment, and like any experiment, you're not quite sure how it's going to turn out.
Yes, and we're still sort of wondering, right? And as I think you said something to the effect of, it's a republic if you can keep it.
And keep it, yes.
If
And
you can keep it.
well, it was pretty tenuous, certainly at the beginning. That the people, I think, probably as time goes on, will not realize how how monumental it was to unite what were really 13 separate countries with a great deal of individual power and diverse interests and such into one one central republic in a way, even though a federal system, if you will. But to me, and to many of us, it seemed necessary. I perhaps had more experience with seeing the world up close, to seeing certainly Europe and such, because I had traveled. And I knew, first of all, how vulnerable this country would be, and how ripe for the picking, if you will, we were once we gained our independence. Uh, we had a lot of things that many countries had their eye on, and we had no way of defending ourselves at that point. Just one of the many reasons we needed that Constitution. We didn't have a standing army. We didn't want that. We had no way of appropriating money for it. So it was an experiment, but it was based on some pretty good intelligence, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you all had done a lot of homework on this, which is amazing. So, a lot of the folks that are listening now are wondering if you have any advice as a marketer. These are folks who have work at companies and are looking to, grow their businesses. And you certainly grew a business. Do you have any sort of advice that you would give to modern marketers?
Well, I suppose you all are a pretty sophisticated bunch, so you probably have a lot of advice already. I mean, certainly, as I said, just for example, going back to trying to sell the King France on taking a chance on this product that we called American Independence. Um, you have to it's wonderful to have a product or whatever that you think is wonderful, or an idea that you think is wonderful, but obviously somebody has to want it. So you have to appeal to them to see why they would want it. And maybe sometimes you have to be very creative in those approaches. And I really I don't think it's a terribly sophisticated thing when you boil it down. It's just a matter of getting past. First of all, it's like writing. As a writer, I learned years ago. Sometimes you fall in love with what you've written, and you get a little bit blind to any improvements there might be. And sometimes, if you are trying to sell something, you can't get too much caught up in how wonderful it is, and not listen to the points of view of other people about it. So these are just common sense things, I think, which most of it is based upon.
Well, thank you for that. And I am particularly inspired by some words from Poor Richard's Almanac, which are well done is better than well said. And in a world of marketers where you often spend a lot of time on the words, ultimately it's the actions, it's the deeds that you do. And even in your example, we needed Saratoga, we needed a victory, an action to sort of convince the king that maybe we were worth a bet. All right. Well, Dr. Franklin, it has been a treat beyond treats for me to have you on the show. You are the original Renegade marketer. So thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you. Fortunately, I'm at a point in my life where I have a lot of time, but I'm still busy. People still ask. I mean, I've been trying to retire for many years, and people keep coming by and wanting me to get involved in something else. I was ready to retire when I was asked to go to France. I was ready to retire when they asked me to be the president of the Council of Pennsylvania, or when they asked me to be a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. But on the other hand, I always get pretty excited when there's an interesting project, an interesting challenge. And so it's been my pleasure to engage with you today.
All right. Well, thank you. And to all the listeners, if you would be loved, love and be lovable. Thank you, Dr. Franklin, and thank you to the listeners.